There is a narrow strip of water in the Persian Gulf that the entire world depends on. It is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, 21 miles. You could drive across it in less than 30 minutes. You could swim it if you were brave enough in a few hours. But through those 21 miles, every single day, flows roughly 20% of the world's oil supply. Tankers, one after another, moving in careful procession through waters that are simultaneously the most critical and the most dangerous maritime choke point on the planet. This is the Strait of Hormuz, and it has just become the center of a crisis that nobody fully saw coming, except for one side. When President Trump ordered a second military strike in the Strait of Hormuz, the decision was meant to send an unmistakable message to Tehran. America is serious, America is willing to use force, and America will not tolerate Iranian interference with the free flow of global commerce through these waters. But Iran had been ready for this moment, months of preparation, layers of deception, a trap built piece by piece, hidden in plain sight, waiting for exactly the order that Trump gave. And when the trap closed, Israel, watching from the sidelines, fully expecting an American victory, was left completely stunned. Welcome to Command Brief. This is the full story of the second strike on the Strait of Hormuz. How it happened, why it happened, what Iran had planned, and what it means for every person on this planet. Let's begin. The Strait of Hormuz, the world's most dangerous choke point. Before we get into the strike, the trap, and the stunning reversal that followed, we need to spend a moment understanding what the Strait of Hormuz actually is, because without that understanding, nothing else in this story makes sense. The Strait of Hormuz is the narrow passage of water that connects the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman, and from there to the wider Indian Ocean. On one side sits Iran. On the other side sit the United Arab Emirates and Oman. The strait is roughly 33 miles wide at its widest point and just 21 miles wide at its narrowest. Within that narrow corridor, the international shipping lanes are only about 2 miles wide in each direction. Every day, somewhere between 17 and 21 million barrels of crude oil pass through the Strait of Hormuz. That represents roughly 1/5 of the world's total daily oil consumption. The countries that send oil through this strait include Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, the UAE, and Iran itself. The countries that receive that oil include China, Japan, South Korea, India, and economies across Europe and beyond. There is no practical alternative, no pipeline network that can replace the volume that moves through Hormuz, no other maritime route that can be activated quickly enough to prevent a global energy shock if the strait were closed even for a few weeks. This is why the Strait of Hormuz has been called, by military strategists and energy economists alike, the world's most important choke point. Control it, and you hold the global economy by the throat. Threaten it, and oil prices spike within hours. Close it, even temporarily, and the consequences ripple through every economy on Earth. Iran knows this better than anyone. The Strait of Hormuz has been Iran's ultimate strategic card for decades. Tehran has threatened to close it, has practiced closing it in military exercises, has sent Revolutionary Guard speedboats to harass tankers moving through it, has on multiple occasions seized vessels operating in its waters, and now, with American military pressure mounting, with sanctions biting deeper than ever, and with the memory of the first American strike still fresh, Iran had decided that the Strait of Hormuz was where the next confrontation would be fought, on Iran's terms, in Iran's waters, against an adversary that had just made the mistake of thinking it understood what it was walking into. It did not. The first strike, setting the stage. To understand the second strike, we need to briefly revisit the first, because the second strike did not happen in isolation. It was a direct consequence of the first, and understanding what the first strike achieved and what it failed to achieve is essential to understanding why Trump ordered a second one. The first American military action in the Strait had been a targeted operation against Iranian naval assets and Revolutionary Guard facilities positioned along the Iranian coastline. The stated objectives were to degrade Iran's ability to threaten commercial shipping, to demonstrate American resolve, and to create leverage for diplomatic negotiations. In tactical terms, the first strike achieved some of its objectives. Several Iranian fast attack boat bases were damaged, a radar installation was destroyed. Fuel and ammunition depots were hit. The operation was clean, precise, and, from a purely military standpoint, largely successful. But strategically, the first strike failed, not because it missed its targets, but because it missed Iran's actual center of gravity. Iran did not respond the way American planners had expected. There was no diplomatic outreach, no signals of willingness to negotiate, no public acknowledgement of the damage sustained. Instead, Tehran went quiet, dangerously quiet, the kind of quiet that experienced intelligence analysts recognize not as weakness or shock, but as preparation. The Iranian leadership had made a calculation. One American strike was a message, a second American strike would be an escalation, and an escalation that Iran had decided, long before it happened, to meet with the full force of its asymmetric capabilities. In the weeks between the first strike and the second, Iran moved assets quietly and carefully. Revolutionary Guard naval units repositioned, missile batteries were activated and then deactivated in patterns designed to confuse American surveillance. Fast attack boats moved to new bases, some of them hidden in civilian harbor facilities that American targeting protocols would make it politically costly to strike. And deep beneath the mountains of coastal Iran, in the underground missile cities that American bombs had not been able to reach, launch crews ran final checks on weapons that had been pre-targeted against specific coordinates in the Strait of Hormuz. The trap was set. All Iran needed was the order that Trump was about to give. The decision, why Trump ordered a second strike. The decision to order a second strike on the Strait of Hormuz came after weeks of intelligence reports that Iranian forces were continuing to threaten commercial shipping in the region. Several tankers had been harassed by Revolutionary Guard speedboats. One vessel, carrying cargo bound for an American ally, had been briefly seized before being released under diplomatic pressure. Iranian drones had been spotted shadowing American and Allied warships moving through the Gulf. In the White House, the assessment was straightforward. The first strike had not been enough. Iran had absorbed the blow, made no concessions, and returned to the same threatening behavior that had triggered the first strike in the first place. The lesson that Tehran appeared to be drawing was that it could absorb American military pressure and continue operating as before. Trump was not willing to accept that conclusion. The political cost of appearing weak in the face of Iranian defiance was, in the White House's calculation, higher than the risks of a second, larger strike. American credibility, not just in the Middle East but globally, depended on demonstrating that the first strike was not a one-time event but the beginning of a sustained policy of pressure. The second strike was designed to be significantly more expansive than the first. Not just fast attack boat bases and radar installations this time. The target list included Iranian naval command and control facilities, additional Revolutionary Guard bases along the coast, and, most significantly, the underwater infrastructure that Iran used to monitor and potentially mine the shipping lanes through the strait. The intelligence assessment presented to the president by his national security team was confident. Iranian forces had been significantly degraded by the first strike. The second strike would finish the job, and with Iran's naval threat in the strait neutralized, the leverage for a negotiated resolution to the broader nuclear standoff would be dramatically increased. The assessment was wrong, not because the intelligence was fabricated or the analysis was dishonest, but because Iran had been deliberately feeding false signals into the intelligence picture, creating a carefully constructed illusion of weakness and disorganization designed to invite exactly the second strike that was now being ordered. The order was given, the strike packages were assembled, the fleet moved into position, and Iran's trap clicked shut. Iran's trap, months in, the trap that Iran had constructed in the Strait of Hormuz was a masterpiece of asymmetric military planning. It had been built over months, using a combination of deception, patience, and a deep understanding of how American military decision-making works. The first element of the trap was the deception operation. Iran's intelligence services had spent weeks feeding false information into channels they knew American intelligence was monitoring, communications suggesting that key assets had been damaged in the first strike, logistics reports indicating shortages of spare parts and ammunition, personnel records showing that experienced commanders had been transferred away from coastal units. All of it was fabricated, carefully constructed to reinforce the American assessment that Iran's naval forces in the strait had been significantly degraded and that a second strike would finish the job. The Americans believed what they saw in their intelligence feeds. They had no reason not to. The information was internally consistent, corroborated by multiple sources, and confirmed what the analysts already suspected. This is the art of strategic deception. You do not simply hide your strength, You actively show your adversary what you want them to see. You give them evidence that confirms their existing beliefs, and you let their own analytical process lead them to the conclusion you need them to reach. The second element was repositioning. While the deception operation kept American attention focused on the wrong things, Iran quietly moved its most capable assets into positions that would give them maximum effect when the second strike was ordered. Anti-ship missile batteries were relocated to new firing positions along the coast and on small islands within the strait. Submarine units moved to pre-assigned patrol areas in the deeper waters beyond the strait's western entrance. Fast attack boat squadrons dispersed to camouflage positions in small coves and inlets along the Iranian coastline. The third element was timing. Iran had analyzed the pattern of American strike planning carefully enough to develop a reasonable estimate of how long the window between the decision to strike and the actual strike would be. That window, measured in hours, not days, was enough time to activate the final phase of the trap. Missile batteries went to their highest readiness state. Boat squadrons received their pre-planned attack orders. Submarine commanders received their targeting coordinates. Everything was in place. Everything was ready. The Americans were coming, and they were coming exactly where Iran needed them to be. The Strait of Hormuz, on that day, was not a target. It was a killing ground. The strike and the counter-strike. The second American strike on the Strait of Hormuz began in the pre-dawn hours, when darkness and the element of surprise were expected to maximize the effectiveness of the attack. American aircraft launched from carrier decks and from land bases. Tomahawk cruise missiles were fired from American submarines and surface ships positioned in the Gulf of Oman, safely outside the strait's most dangerous waters. The strike was large, larger than the first. The target list was comprehensive, and the initial wave of attacks, precision munitions delivered against Iranian coastal facilities, achieved their physical objectives. Buildings were destroyed, radar systems were knocked offline. The visible above-ground infrastructure that had been targeted was, in the first minutes of the strike, clearly damaged. American commanders monitoring the engagement in real time saw exactly what they expected to see: explosions at the target coordinates, secondary fires suggesting ammunition and fuel stores had been hit, radar emissions from Iranian air defense systems going dark as the facilities that housed them were destroyed. For approximately 12 minutes, everything went according to plan. Then the Iranian response began. It did not start with missiles. It started with something smaller, faster, and harder to track. Dozens of Iranian fast attack boats emerged simultaneously from their concealed positions along the coastline. They moved in coordinated swarms, spreading across the surface of the strait in patterns specifically designed to complicate the targeting solutions of American weapons systems. Small, fast, and maneuvering aggressively, they were difficult targets even for the most sophisticated naval gunnery systems. But their purpose was not primarily to attack. Their purpose was to force American ships to turn their weapons systems toward them, to consume defensive capacity, to create noise and confusion in the tactical picture, and to draw attention away from what was coming next. From the mountainsides and hidden valleys of the Iranian coast, anti-ship cruise missiles launched in rapid succession, not one, not 10, dozens, from multiple directions simultaneously, flying low over the water at speeds that compressed American reaction times to a matter of seconds. The missiles were targeted at specific American ships, not randomly, but with a precision that suggested Iran had pre-assigned targeting solutions for each vessel in the American force. Simultaneously, from the deeper waters of the Gulf of Oman, Iranian submarine units fired torpedoes at American ships that had been operating under the assumption that the submarine threat in those waters had been neutralized. That assumption was wrong. The submarines had been quietly repositioned in the days before the strike, moving to new patrol areas that American anti-submarine patrols had not been covering adequately. The combined effect of fast attack boat swarms, simultaneous cruise missile salvos from multiple directions, and submarine-launched torpedoes created exactly the multi-domain saturation that Iran's planners had designed for. American ships fought back with everything they had. Phalanx systems engaged. Standard missiles were fired in rapid succession. Electronic warfare systems worked to decoy incoming missiles away from their intended targets. Some of the incoming weapons were defeated, many were not. American ships sustained damage, serious damage. The kind of damage that takes ships out of the fight, that costs lives, that creates the images and the casualty reports that change public opinion and political calculations overnight. The second strike on the Strait of Hormuz had become something nobody in Washington had planned for, a genuine naval battle in the most dangerous waters in the world, against an adversary that had prepared for this moment far more carefully than America had. Israel's reaction stunned into silence. Israel had been watching the second strike unfold with a mixture of confidence and anxiety. Confidence because Israeli intelligence had been deeply involved in the planning process and shared the American assessment that the strike would achieve its objectives. Anxiety because the situation with Iran was one that directly affected Israeli security, and any miscalculation carried consequences that Israel would pay for as surely as America. When the Iranian counterstrike began, Israeli military commanders watching the engagement feeds in real time initially struggled to process what they were seeing. The pattern of Iranian response did not match any of the scenarios that joint American-Israeli intelligence assessments had identified as likely. The coordination was too good. The timing was too precise. The weapons systems being deployed were appearing in locations where Israeli intelligence had assessed them as absent. The realization came quickly and was deeply uncomfortable. The intelligence picture had been wrong, systematically wrong, not in random ways that might suggest analytical errors, but in consistent ways that suggested deliberate manipulation. Iran had not simply hidden its capabilities, it had actively deceived the combined intelligence apparatus of the United States and Israel, two of the most sophisticated intelligence communities in the world. For Israel, this realization carried implications that went far beyond the immediate battle unfolding in the Strait. If Iran had successfully deceived American and Israeli intelligence about its capabilities and intentions in the Strait of Hormuz, what else had it deceived them about? Where else were hidden capabilities waiting to be revealed? What other traps had been laid that had not yet been sprung? The Israeli military went to its highest alert status, not because of anything happening in the Strait, but because of everything that the events in the Strait implied about what might be coming next. Israeli leaders, who had been publicly supportive of American pressure on Iran and had privately encouraged the second strike, found themselves in a position of profound strategic discomfort. They had encouraged an action that had gone badly wrong. They had shared intelligence assessments that had proved to be manipulated. And they were now watching an American military force take damage in a battle that Israel had helped to initiate. The Israeli government went silent publicly. No statements of support, no declarations of solidarity, no carefully worded expressions of concern, just silence. And that silence, from America's closest ally in the region, at the moment when American forces needed support most, said everything about how stunned Israel truly was. It was not the silence of indifference. It was the silence of a government that had just realized it had been wrong about something fundamental, and that getting it wrong had consequences that were still unfolding: the global shockwave, oil, power, and the New World Order. As the battle in the Strait of Hormuz reached its most intense phase, the consequences were already radiating outward through the global system at the speed of financial markets and breaking news. Oil prices moved first. Within minutes of the first reports of Iranian counterstrikes against American ships, crude oil futures spiked by more than 20%. This was not panic selling. This was a rational market response to a rational threat assessment. The Strait of Hormuz was a combat zone. Tanker operators immediately began diverting vessels away from the strait. Insurance premiums for any ship attempting to transit the strait went to levels that made commercial transit economically unviable. The practical effect was immediate. The flow of oil through the strait slowed dramatically. Tankers that had been en route turned around. Tankers already in the Gulf remained at anchor rather than attempt the transit under combat conditions. The 20% of global oil supply that moves through Hormuz every day was no longer moving. Stock markets around the world went into freefall. Energy stocks spiked while everything else dropped. Airlines, manufacturers, shipping companies, any business that depends on affordable energy, saw their valuations collapse in real time as traders priced in a world where Persian Gulf oil was indefinitely unavailable. In Beijing, the Chinese government convened an emergency meeting of its National Security Commission. China is the world's largest importer of oil, and a significant fraction of that oil transits the Strait of Hormuz. A prolonged closure of the strait was not just an economic problem for China, it was a strategic emergency. And China's response, how Beijing chose to use its relationship with Tehran, its economic leverage and its diplomatic weight, would shape the resolution of the crisis as much as anything happening on the water. In Moscow, the Kremlin watched with barely concealed satisfaction. Russia is a major oil exporter. Higher oil prices, triggered by a crisis in the Persian Gulf, directly benefit the Russian economy at a moment when it desperately needs that benefit. Beyond the economic dimension, a major American military setback in the Middle East served Russian strategic interests by demonstrating to the world that American power has limits and that challenging it is possible. In European capitals, governments that had supported American pressure on Iran were suddenly facing the consequences of a policy that had escalated beyond what any of them had anticipated. Energy prices were rising, public opinion was shifting, the political sustainability of continued support for American military action in the Gulf was coming under serious pressure. The second strike on the Strait of Hormuz had been intended to demonstrate American strength. Instead, it had triggered a global crisis that demonstrated something more complicated, that in the modern world, military action by the world's most powerful military can still produce strategic outcomes that nobody intended and nobody wanted. What Iran proved, the new rules of deterrence. When the immediate military engagement in the strait wound down, not through a decisive victory by either side, but through the kind of exhausted, mutually damaging pause that characterizes modern naval combat, the question on every analyst's mind was the same. What had Iran just proved? The answer was several things, and all of them mattered. First, Iran had demonstrated that its deception capabilities are genuinely world-class. Fooling American intelligence is hard. Fooling American and Israeli intelligence simultaneously, systematically over a period of months, while maintaining operational security tight enough that not a single significant leak compromised the trap, that is an extraordinary intelligence achievement. It demands a fundamental reassessment of how much confidence American and Allied planners can place in their intelligence picture of Iranian capabilities and intentions. Second, Iran had demonstrated that its anti-ship capabilities are significantly more capable than the pre-strike assessment had suggested. The coordination of fast attack boats, cruise missiles, and submarine forces in a multi-domain saturation attack that genuinely challenged American naval defenses was not the performance of a degraded, disorganized force. It was the performance of a military that had been quietly improving its capabilities while successfully hiding those improvements from adversary surveillance. Third, and perhaps most importantly, Iran had demonstrated that it is willing to absorb American military strikes and respond with force. This matters enormously for deterrence calculations going forward. If Iran is willing to exchange military blows with the United States, to accept damage to its own infrastructure in exchange for the ability to inflict damage on American forces, then the threat of American military action is a less effective deterrent than it was before the second strike. That last point reshapes the entire strategic equation in the Middle East. American military power works as a deterrent only to the extent that adversaries believe the cost of challenging it outweighs the benefits. Iran has just demonstrated to the region and the world that it does not share that belief, and every government watching, whether a potential American partner or a potential American adversary, has updated its own calculations accordingly. This is the strategic significance of what happened in the Strait of Hormuz, not the specific ships damaged or the specific facilities destroyed, but the message sent to every player in the global system about the real limits of American power and the real capabilities of Iranian resistance. The road ahead, diplomacy or escalation. In the aftermath of the second strike and Iran's stunning counterstrike, the immediate question facing every government involved was simple and urgent. What comes next? The options on the table were stark. On one end, a third strike, a massive escalation designed to overwhelm Iran's defenses and destroy its military capabilities at a scale that the first two strikes had not attempted. On the other end, a return to diplomacy, using the mutual damage and the sobering demonstration of Iranian capabilities as leverage to push both sides toward a negotiated resolution. The case for escalation was made loudly in certain quarters of the American political establishment. The argument was that American credibility demanded a decisive response to Iran's successful counterstrike, that allowing Iran to believe it had won a military engagement against the United States would embolden not just Tehran, but every other adversary watching from the sidelines, that the only way to restore deterrence was to demonstrate at overwhelming scale that American military power could not be successfully challenged. The case for diplomacy was made with equal force by others. The argument was that the second strike had already demonstrated the limits of purely military approaches to the Iran problem, that Iran had shown it could absorb strikes and impose real costs on American forces in response. That continued escalation risked a full-scale regional war with consequences that would make the current crisis look manageable by comparison. Behind the scenes, back-channel communications were already flowing through every available diplomatic conduit. Oman, which has historically played a role as an intermediary between Washington and Tehran, was active. Qatar, which hosts a major American military base while simultaneously maintaining a functional relationship with Iran, was facilitating contacts. Even China, which had strong economic incentives to see the strait reopened and the crisis de-escalated, was quietly signaling a willingness to use its relationship with Tehran to push for talks. The outcome of those contacts was not yet clear. Iran's leadership was divided between hardliners who saw the successful counterstrike as validation of their strategy and moderates who recognized that prolonged military confrontation with the United States carried existential risks for the Iranian state. The American administration was navigating between its public posture of strength and its private recognition that the situation had become genuinely dangerous. The Strait of Hormuz remained tense, the oil kept not flowing, the markets kept pricing in uncertainty, and somewhere between escalation and diplomacy, the world waited to see which direction the next move would take. Outro. The Strait of Hormuz, 21 miles at its narrowest, enough water to swim across, enough strategic importance to shake the global economy, test the limits of American military power, and leave one of America's closest allies standing in stunned silence. Trump ordered a second attack. Iran had set the trap months in advance, and the world that emerged from that confrontation was one where the rules had shifted in ways that will take years to fully understand. Here is what we know for certain. The era of cost-free American military action in the Persian Gulf is over. Not because American power has diminished, but because Iran has spent decades building the specific capabilities needed to impose real costs on any force that operates in its backyard. And those capabilities, as the second strike demonstrated, are more advanced and more capable than the pre-strike intelligence had suggested. We also know that the Strait of Hormuz is not just a military problem, it is an economic problem, a diplomatic problem, and a geopolitical problem of the first order. Any solution that relies solely on military force is unlikely to produce a stable, lasting outcome. The complexity of the interests at stake, American credibility, Iranian survival, global energy security, Chinese economic stability, Israeli security, demands a solution that addresses multiple dimensions simultaneously. And we know that intelligence, however good, however sophisticated, however well-resourced, can be deceived. The trap that Iran set was a deception operation as much as it was a military operation, and defeating that kind of sophisticated deception requires not just better surveillance technology, but a fundamental willingness to question our assumptions and challenge our pre-existing beliefs. These are hard lessons. They are lessons that come with a price, measured in damaged ships, in American lives, in disrupted oil flows, and in the stunned silence of allies who thought they understood the situation and found out they did not. Command Brief exists to help you understand the world as it actually is, not as we wish it were. And the world as it actually is, in the Strait of Hormuz and across the broader Middle East, is more complicated, more dangerous, and more resistant to simple solutions than any headline can capture. If this briefing gave you a clearer picture of what is happening and why it matters, hit that subscribe button right now. Share this video with someone who needs to understand these events, and drop your thoughts in the comments. Do you think America should escalate or negotiate? What is Iran's next move? What should Israel do? The conversation matters. The understanding matters. Stay informed. Stay sharp. This has been Command Brief.